Imagine discovering that your spouse didn't just betray you, but filmed it, sold it, and hid it for months. This is the story of how one dark secret unraveled my entire world. So, a bit of background, my name's David, and I'm 36. I work as a doctor, a surgeon, actually, so as you can imagine, my life is busy. Long hours, intense shifts, lots of responsibility. My wife, Emily, is 34. She's a stay-at-home mom to our 2 kids, which I thought was the perfect arrangement. She always seemed happy at home, and I thought our family was a solid team. To everyone else, we looked like the perfect couple. I mean, Emily was everything you could ask for in a wife: kind, supportive, warm. But looking back now, I realize there were signs that maybe things weren't as perfect as they seemed. For starters, Emily always kept a lot of her personal life to herself. She was close to her phone, always texting or scrolling, but she'd laugh off any questions about it. "Just some mom friends," she'd say, waving it away. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that every marriage has its quirks. But a few months ago, things started to feel off. It was subtle, nothing that would scream trouble, but I could sense something changing between us. And little did I know, that something was about to upend my entire life. As the weeks went by, I couldn't shake this feeling that something was going on. Emily started acting distant, nothing drastic, just small things that seemed a bit off. She'd spend more time on her phone, laughing at texts or quickly turning her screen away when I walked by. Whenever I asked about it, she'd brush it off, telling me it was just a mom's group chat or some influencer she'd been following. One night, I got home from a double shift around midnight, exhausted but glad to finally be back with my family. I expected to find Emily asleep, like usual, but instead, I walked in to see her on the couch, headphones in, staring intently at her phone. She looked almost startled when she noticed me, like she hadn't expected me to catch her. "Oh, you're home early," she said, quickly locking her phone and giving me a slightly forced smile. It was such a small moment, but something about it made my stomach turn. Emily wasn't the type to hide things from me, or at least, she never had been. She put on her usual warm smile, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more going on beneath the surface. "Yeah, got lucky tonight," I said, trying to sound casual. "What were you watching?" She hesitated, just for a split second, before shrugging it off. "Oh, just a video one of the moms sent me. Nothing interesting." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust her like I always had. But that feeling, that something wasn't quite right, kept growing. I told myself I was just overthinking it. After all, Emily and I had been together for over a decade. But it was that moment that planted the first real seed of doubt. And as it turned out, that seed was about to grow into something I never could have imagined. I tried to shake off the feeling, but something about that night kept nagging at me. Emily was becoming more secretive by the day. So one weekend, when she went out for a quick coffee with a friend, I decided to clean up the house a bit. I was sorting through a drawer in the bedroom, one where we keep some household bills, when I came across something strange, a new, high-end phone that I'd never seen before. I turned it on, half expecting it to be locked, but to my surprise, it wasn't. I felt guilty snooping, but curiosity got the better of me. I scrolled through, wondering why she'd have a second phone she hadn't told me about. Then, I found something that made my blood run cold. In her photo gallery was a single video, one I didn't recognize. I tapped on it, and what I saw shattered me. There was Emily, clear as day, in our bedroom, but she wasn't alone. A man I didn't recognize was there with her, and I quickly realized what I was watching. They'd filmed themselves together, and it was clear they were both aware of the camera. My head spun. Emily had always been trustworthy, or so I'd thought. And this was more than just an affair. She'd recorded it. For a few minutes, I just stood there, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. But as I continued looking through the phone, the story got even worse. There was a folder labeled Sales. Inside were messages, some with money transfer confirmations, showing that she'd been selling copies of this video online. This wasn't some moment of weakness, she'd been selling the recording for months, making money off it. And I was the last person to know. Stunned, I sat down, my mind racing. This wasn't the woman I thought I married, and now I had to figure out what to do next. After that discovery, my mind wouldn't rest. The betrayal, the hidden phone, the fact that she'd profited off it, all of it left me shattered. That evening, I sat in silence, waiting for Emily to come home. I had to confront her, but I didn't even know where to start. When she finally walked through the door, cheerful and oblivious, I took a deep breath and tried to keep my voice steady. "Emily, we need to talk." She looked at me, her smile fading as she sensed the seriousness in my tone. "Sure, what's wrong?" I reached over, pulling the hidden phone out of my pocket and placing it on the table between us. Her face turned pale as she stared at it, instantly recognizing it. How did you find that?" she stammered. "I think the better question is, why do you have it?" I replied, keeping my voice calm, though every word felt like fire. "And, Emily, why is there a video of you with another man on it? And why have you been selling it?" She froze, her mouth opening but no words coming out. I watched the shock, then guilt, flash across her face as she realized there was no way to talk herself out of this. I can explain," she finally managed, her voice trembling. It's not what you think, David. It only happened once." "Once?" I echoed, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Emily, this wasn't a one-time mistake. You recorded it, and then you went and sold it to strangers. You hid all of this from me, for months." She took a step back, putting her hands over her face, tears beginning to form. "I didn't plan this," she whispered. "It was a stupid, reckless decision. I needed the money, and I didn't know how to tell you. I thought I could just keep it hidden." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The woman I'd trusted, the woman I'd built a life with, had done all of this right under my nose. And for what? A quick thrill. A little extra money. "You didn't know how to tell me." "Emily, you didn't tell me because you knew it would destroy us," I said, feeling my hands tremble with anger. "And here we are." She sank into the chair, covering her face, and I was left wondering if there was anything left of the life we'd shared. I stared at her, trying to make sense of everything. "You needed money?" I asked, almost laughing at the absurdity of it. "Emily, I work hard every day as a doctor. We're not struggling. You know I'd do anything to make sure we have what we need. If you needed money, all you had to do was tell me. Why on earth would you choose this?" She looked down, her face flushed with guilt, and I could see she was struggling to come up with an answer. But the silence stretched on, and with each second that passed, her lack of an explanation felt like a deeper betrayal. "Why, Emily?" I pressed, leaning forward, needing her to at least try to make this make sense. "Why would you go behind my back? Sell that video to complete strangers? I don't understand. Was it about the money? Or was it about something else?" She swallowed, her eyes fixed on her hands as she fidgeted, twisting her fingers in her lap. But she still couldn't look at me. She couldn't even bring herself to give me a reason. "David," she finally murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know. I really don't know what I was thinking. It was a stupid decision, maybe I thought it would be harmless. I just thought. I don't know." I took a deep breath, her vague words only fueling my frustration. "Harmless? You thought this would be harmless? Emily, you shattered everything we built together for a little extra cash that we didn't even need. I thought I knew you." She looked up, her eyes pleading. "I'm sorry, David. I don't know," I felt, but her words trailed off, leaving only a stunned silence. She didn't have an answer, not one that could justify any of this. And I realized then that maybe I would never understand why she did it. Sitting across from Emily, watching her struggle to explain herself, I felt a wave of anger and betrayal that I'd never experienced before. She couldn't even give me a reason, couldn't even say why she'd risked our entire marriage for something so reckless. Her vague, empty apologies only confirmed it. She had no idea of the damage she'd done. As I sat there, a new thought took hold. She'd betrayed me in the worst way possible, and she thought a simple apology would make it all disappear. She'd hidden her actions for months, and I'd been left in the dark, oblivious to the lie she'd been living right under my nose. But now, the tables had turned. I had the proof in my hands, her secret, the betrayal, the money she'd pocketed behind my back. And as much as it went against my better nature, I felt a strange satisfaction in the idea that maybe she should feel the same pain, the same humiliation that she'd put me through. I didn't want to make a hasty move, so I left her there, alone in the living room, stunned and speechless. I could see she was shaken, but I wasn't ready to let her off that easy. In the days that followed, I began to make my plans. First, I contacted a lawyer, wanting to understand my options. We had assets together, a home, and shared finances, but I wanted a clear path that would leave her with as little as possible. Legally, I'd do everything in my power to make sure that she would face consequences for her choices. But it wasn't just about the legal fallout. I wanted her to face the public shame of what she'd done. I wanted her to know that the people she cared about, the ones who thought she was the perfect, devoted wife, would see her true colors. I started gathering the evidence, building a case that would ensure everyone knew exactly what she'd done, and how she'd chosen to betray me and betray the life we'd built together. For the first time, I felt that I was back in control. Emily's lies had unraveled, and now she was the one who would face the consequences. It was harsh, maybe even cruel, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd earned every bit of what was coming. In the days that followed, I put my plan into action. I was done listening to empty apologies and half-hearted excuses. This time, I'd make sure Emily felt the full weight of what she'd done. The first step was financial. With the help of my lawyer, I began separating our finances. We froze joint accounts, making it clear that she wouldn't have access to my income. I wanted her to know that her comfortable life was about to change. Every dollar she'd hidden or made off that video was going to come back to haunt her. I made sure she'd have no access to the financial security she'd taken for granted. But that wasn't enough. I needed her to feel the same betrayal, the same shame I'd felt. So, I began reaching out to people close to her, her friends, her sister, even her parents. I knew they all thought of her as this ideal wife, someone who devoted herself to our family. I wanted them to know the truth. I scheduled a lunch with her sister, Sarah, who had always admired our marriage. Over coffee, I carefully laid out everything. I could see the shock on her face as I told her the full story, the affair, the secret phone, and the recordings she'd been selling for months. Sarah's eyes were wide with disbelief, and I watched as the image of her perfect sister shattered before her. By the time I'd finished, she was speechless, shaking her head in disgust. "I never thought she was capable of something like this," she whispered. And that was just the beginning. Emily's betrayal wasn't going to stay hidden. Word began spreading through our circle of friends, and soon enough, everyone knew. People who had once thought of her as a kind, loving wife now saw her for who she really was. Friends began distancing themselves from her, and her social life, the one she'd built with so much effort, started to crumble. And at home, she could feel it too. I gave her the cold shoulder, keeping conversations strictly to logistics and decisions about the kids. Every time she tried to talk, to apologize, I'd shut her down, reminding her that the damage was already done. But as satisfying as it was to see her life unravel, I could feel the toll it was taking on both of us. My anger and bitterness consumed me, and I realized that no amount of revenge would fully heal the betrayal I'd felt. But I wasn't finished yet. I had one final step in mind to truly make her face her choices. As word of Emily's betrayal spread, I could see her world collapsing bit by bit. Friends no longer reached out, family members distanced themselves, and the image she had carefully crafted over the years was unraveling before her eyes. But there was still one final piece that I wanted to set into motion, a way to make her face the full impact of her actions. The idea hit me one night as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the anger and hurt. Emily had been willing to profit off our life and betray our trust for the sake of a few extra dollars. So, I decided that the last step would be to remove the stability she had always relied on. If she had wanted independence so badly that she'd go to these lengths, then that's exactly what I'd give her. I began working with my lawyer to finalize a divorce plan that would leave her with the bare minimum. We owned a home, cars, and had several shared investments, but I wanted to ensure that she couldn't fall back on any of it. I arranged for her to leave the house, to have no access to the assets we'd built together, and to be left facing the full reality of the life she'd chosen. The paperwork was set. With a few signatures, I would finally be free from the weight of this betrayal. The day I served her the divorce papers, I asked her to sit down. She looked at me, a mixture of desperation and resignation in her eyes, as if she knew what was coming but still held on to a glimmer of hope. "Emily," I began, laying the documents on the table between us, "this is where it ends. I'm done with the lies, the betrayal, and the complete disregard you've shown for our life together." Her face went pale as she glanced at the papers, realizing that there was no going back. "David, please," she stammered. "I've made terrible mistakes, but I'll do anything to make it right." "It's too late for that," I said firmly. "You made your choices. And now, you'll live with the consequences." Tears welled up in her eyes as she signed each page, her hands shaking. But for once, I felt a strange sense of peace. The betrayal was behind me, and with each signature, I could feel a weight lifting. In the days that followed, Emily moved out, and I felt the quiet of an empty house, a new kind of silence, but a peaceful one. I could finally start over, free from the lies and deceit that had once held me back. There was healing to be done, sure, but for the first time, I was hopeful about the future. I knew it wouldn't be easy to rebuild, but I was ready to take the steps forward. And as for Emily, she'd have to start from scratch, to figure out life without the comfort and stability she'd once taken for granted. I didn't know what would become of her, but I knew that I was finally free. A few weeks after the divorce was finalized, I thought I'd finally turned a corner. I was rebuilding my life, focusing on work and trying to create some sense of normalcy. Emily and I had agreed that she'd have the kids for a few days each week, and while the thought of them staying with her still made me uneasy, I reminded myself that she was still their mother. But one evening, as I was wrapping up at work, my phone buzzed with a text message that made my heart stop. It was from my oldest son, Jake. The message was short, panicked, and full of typos, but I understood every word. "Dad, please come get us. Mom is going crazy. She hit me, and she's been yelling. I'm scared. Please take us away." I could hardly believe what I was reading. Emily had never been violent, she'd always been the calm, composed one. But now, my son was pleading for help, telling me that his own mother had hit him. I felt a mix of shock, anger, and dread settle over me as I grabbed my keys and rushed out of the hospital, barely able to process what was happening. The drive felt like a blur. All I could think about was getting to my kids as quickly as possible. I kept replaying his message in my mind, hoping there was some kind of misunderstanding. But as I pulled up to the house, the eerie silence only confirmed my worst fears. I rushed inside, calling out for my kids. The house was in disarray, furniture slightly out of place, and a few broken items scattered across the living room. My heart pounded as I scanned the room, searching for any sign of them. "Jake? Emma?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty house. And then I heard it, a soft whimper from the hallway. I followed the sound and found my two kids huddled together in their room, both looking terrified. Jake had a faint red mark on his cheek, and Emma, my youngest, clung to his arm with tears in her eyes. "Dad," Jake whispered, relief flooding his face as he saw me. She just lost it. I don't know why. She was yelling about how everything was ruined, and then she hit me. I hugged them both tightly, feeling my own anger and heartbreak rising. "Where is she now?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "She left," Jake replied. "She was crying and shouting, then she just stormed out and left us here alone." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation settle in. Emily had crossed a line, one I could never forgive. I knew in that moment that I couldn't leave them in her care again, not after this. Without another word, I gathered their things, my mind already racing with plans to keep them safe. Emily had gone too far, and I wasn't going to risk my children's well-being. I got them into the car, reassuring them that they were safe now and that they'd be staying with me. On the drive back, I could feel their relief, but I could also see the confusion and sadness in their eyes. This wasn't the life I'd wanted for them. But in that moment, I promised myself that I'd do whatever it took to protect them, to give them a stable, loving home. When we got home, I sat down with Jake and Emma, doing my best to explain the situation. I told them that what their mom had done was wrong, that they didn't deserve to be treated that way, and that I'd be there for them no matter what. Over the next few days, I took steps to make the arrangement official, reaching out to my lawyer and documenting everything that had happened. Emily would no longer have unsupervised visits, I would make sure of that. My priority now was my children and their safety, and I was prepared to do whatever it took to ensure they were protected. As difficult as the road ahead seemed, I knew that I was finally moving forward, free of the chaos and betrayal Emily had brought into our lives. This was the beginning of a new chapter, a chance for healing, for rebuilding, and for finding peace as a family. And as I held my kids close, I realized that, in the end, this was the life I was meant to have. The next step was clear, I needed to protect my kids, and that meant becoming their full legal guardian. After what had happened, the emotional instability, leaving them alone, and even hitting Jake, I knew I couldn't trust Emily with their safety. My lawyer and I gathered every piece of evidence, from Jake's text message to photos of the bruising and the state of the house. We prepared statements from friends and family who had seen her recent, erratic behavior. The day of the first hearing finally arrived, and I was determined to get justice for my kids. Emily was there, looking polished and composed, as if nothing had happened. The moment she saw me, though, her face hardened. She knew what I was fighting for, and I could tell she wasn't going down without a fight. When the judge asked why I was filing for full custody, I laid everything out as clearly as I could. I described the incident, Jake's injuries, and how she'd left them alone in the house. I explained that her recent behavior wasn't just a personal issue, it was putting the kids at risk. But then, it was her turn. And to my shock, Emily denied everything. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and calm, "this is all a complete fabrication. David has twisted things to make it look like I was a threat to our children. I would never harm them, I love them more than anything." She looked at me, her eyes hard. "This is nothing but slander. He's trying to turn my children against me because of our divorce. He's trying to ruin my reputation and make me look like a monster." She painted herself as the victim, accusing me of using the divorce as an excuse to turn the kids against her. I could see the judge watching her, taking notes, and for a moment, I worried that he might believe her. Emily was skilled at twisting words, at making herself look innocent. It was what she'd done so well for years, and now she was using it in the courtroom. But I knew the truth, and so did my children. When it was my turn again, my lawyer calmly presented the evidence. Jake's text message pleading for help, the photos of his injury, and testimony from those who'd noticed Emily's erratic behavior. I read aloud the message Jake had sent me, his words echoing in the quiet courtroom, and I could see the judge's expression change as he took it all in. Emily's confidence faltered. For the first time, she looked visibly shaken, realizing that her story wasn't holding up. Her carefully crafted image was beginning to crumble, and she knew it. She had been so certain she could deny everything, but now, with every piece of evidence, it was clear her lies were unraveling. At the end of the hearing, the judge looked at us both, then turned to Emily with a seriousness that made the whole room feel tense. "Mrs. Richardson," he said, "I find the evidence presented here very troubling. Based on what I've seen today, I'm granting Mr. Richardson temporary full custody of the children until a more thorough investigation can be conducted. Further hearings will determine whether this becomes permanent." Emily's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to protest, but the judge held up a hand to silence her. "Any false statements made in this case, Mrs. Richardson, will carry consequences. I strongly advise you to cooperate with this investigation." The gavel struck, and just like that, the judge left the room. Emily sat there in shock, and for the first time, she had no words, no rebuttal. As I walked out of that courtroom, my children's safety finally secured, I knew I'd done the right thing. The battle wasn't over yet, but I felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever came next, I would be ready, and I would protect my kids, no matter what it took. In the days following the hearing, I could see the relief in my kids' faces as they settled into our new life together. The uncertainty and fear they had felt around their mother were slowly fading, replaced by a sense of security I hadn't seen in them for months. But I knew that the fight wasn't over yet. The court's temporary custody order was just that, temporary. The final hearing would decide whether I would be granted permanent custody and, ultimately, whether Emily would lose her parental rights. To prepare, my lawyer and I left no stone unturned. We gathered statements from Jake and Emma's teachers, who had noticed a change in their behavior around the time of the incidents. We brought in a child psychologist who had met with the kids to assess their well-being and could confirm that the instability at home had affected them deeply. But I also knew that Emily was going to fight back harder than ever. She'd already denied everything, and her refusal to accept responsibility told me that she was prepared to twist the truth to any extent. I steeled myself for what was likely to be an ugly, drawn-out battle. As the date of the final hearing approached, I received a letter from Emily's lawyer, outlining a new defense tactic. Emily was now claiming that I was controlling and manipulative, and that her behavior had been a result of emotional pressure from me. She even claimed that I had turned the children against her by planting negative ideas about her in their minds. Reading the letter filled me with a mix of anger and disbelief. It was yet another lie, an attempt to paint herself as the victim and make me look like the villain. Emily wasn't just trying to save her reputation, she was willing to distort everything, even the reality our kids had lived, to avoid facing the consequences of her actions. My lawyer assured me that her accusations wouldn't hold up in court, especially given the concrete evidence we had. But I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. I knew that Emily's skill at manipulating people had brought us to this point, and I was painfully aware that she could still do damage. The day of the final hearing arrived, and the tension was palpable as we entered the courtroom. Emily sat across from me, her expression a mix of defiance and desperation. She was flanked by her lawyer, who was prepared to argue her latest narrative, that she was a victim of manipulation and that the incidents had been exaggerated. The judge listened as Emily's lawyer presented her side, painting me as overbearing and controlling. They claimed that her actions had been out of character, a result of the supposed pressure I'd created in our marriage. Emily even managed to shed a few tears, a performance I knew all too well, but one that didn't sway me in the slightest. Then it was my turn. My lawyer presented the facts methodically, starting with Jake's desperate message, followed by the testimonies from teachers, the psychologist's assessment, and the evidence from the previous hearings. I could see the judge listening closely, absorbing each piece, and Emily's expression shifting from determination to unease. The judge then did something unexpected. He requested to speak with Jake and Emma privately in his chambers, with only a child advocate present. It was a move meant to protect the kids from the intensity of the courtroom while giving them a chance to share their perspective freely. My heart pounded as I watched them walk away with the advocate. They were so young, and it pained me that they had been forced into such a situation. But I also knew that Jake, especially, was strong and clear-headed, and that he would be honest about what he had experienced. When they returned, I could see the relief in their faces. Whatever they had told the judge, I knew it had been truthful, and I hoped it would make a difference. After a tense silence, the judge reviewed his notes and looked up, his gaze steady and focused. Based on the evidence presented, the assessments of professionals involved, and the private statements of the children, I am making the decision to grant Mr. Richardson full and permanent custody of both children, he announced. Furthermore, given the circumstances, I am terminating Mrs. Richardson's parental rights, with visitation only possible under supervised conditions if recommended by a therapist. Emily gasped, her face draining of all color. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but no words came out. She seemed frozen in shock, unable to process that she had truly lost. As for me, a wave of relief washed over me. I'd done it, I'd fought for my kids, protected them, and secured a stable, loving future for them. I felt like the weight of the world had finally been lifted. In the weeks that followed, life slowly began to settle. My children were safe, and I was ready to help them heal, to show them what it meant to live in a home full of love and security. I knew that Emily's absence would leave a void in their lives, but I was determined to fill it with warmth and consistency. I no longer dwelled on the betrayal, on the lies Emily had woven, or the pain she'd caused. I was focused on the future, on raising my kids in a stable, happy home. This chapter was finally over, and we were ready to begin a new one, free from the shadows of the past. After the court's decision, I knew that the best thing I could do for my kids was to give them a fresh start, one far away from the memories and chaos of the past year. The weight of everything that had happened lingered, and I wanted them to feel as safe and free as possible. So, I made the decision to move to a new state, a place where we could rebuild our lives and focus on healing. I found a quiet town a few hours away, one that had great schools, a strong sense of community, and beautiful parks where the kids could feel at ease. It was a place where they could just be kids again, away from the painful reminders of their mother's actions. We packed up our belongings, said goodbye to a few close friends, and headed out to start our new life. The transition wasn't easy, but it was the best choice we could have made. Our new home was smaller and simpler, but it felt like a blank slate, a place where we could leave behind the shadows of the past. Jake and Emma took to it quickly, exploring the neighborhood, making friends, and adjusting to their new school. For the first time in months, I saw genuine smiles on their faces. I enrolled them in activities they loved, soccer for Jake, art classes for Emma, and watched them blossom in the new environment. Seeing them laugh and relax felt like a victory. I could tell they were finally letting go of some of the fear and uncertainty they'd been carrying. Each day, I felt more confident that we were on the right path. As weeks turned into months, we settled into a comfortable routine. The kids seemed happier, and I felt a renewed sense of purpose as a father. I made sure to be fully present for them, to be the stability they needed. We spent weekends exploring nearby trails, cooking meals together, and building new memories that didn't carry any weight from the past. I also arranged for counseling sessions for both of them. They had been through a lot, and I wanted to make sure they had a safe space to express their feelings. Gradually, they opened up, processing everything they'd been through in a way that allowed them to begin healing. Our lives took on a rhythm I hadn't experienced in years, a quiet, fulfilling sense of normalcy. The kids no longer looked over their shoulders, and I no longer felt the shadow of betrayal hanging over us. We had truly begun to move forward, each of us healing in our own way. And as for me, I found peace in watching my children thrive. I no longer needed revenge or retribution, the life we were building now was all that mattered. I had finally left behind the storm of the past, embracing a future full of hope and new beginnings. We'd found a home, a community, and a new life that was truly ours, free from the chaos that had once engulfed us. And in that, I found a sense of happiness I hadn't thought possible. This was our fresh start, and we were finally ready to embrace it fully. Months passed peacefully, and life in our new town began to feel like home. The kids were thriving, and I'd found a sense of balance I hadn't felt in a long time. Then, out of nowhere, I received a call that brought the past rushing back in a way I hadn't expected. It was from one of Emily's relatives. She informed me that Emily had been undergoing treatment, attending therapy and counseling, trying to prove that she was stable enough to one day see the kids. She'd apparently made some progress, but recently, she'd had a setback. Her relative told me, voice quiet with concern, that Emily had broken down and had to be admitted to a mental health facility for her own safety. I took a deep breath as I processed the news, feeling a twinge of sadness. Despite everything, it was hard to imagine the person I'd once loved now in such a dark place, lost to the choices she'd made and the consequences she now had to live with. I spent a few days debating whether or not to tell Jake and Emma. They'd been adjusting so well, and I didn't want to reopen old wounds. But I also knew that, eventually, they would need to understand the full story, and I wanted them to hear it from me. Sitting them down, I gently explained that their mom had been trying to get help and was in a place where she could get the support she needed. I chose my words carefully, focusing on the fact that she was safe and that her goal was to be well enough to have a healthier relationship with them someday. They listened quietly, taking it all in, and though they were sad, they seemed to understand. Afterward, Jake surprised me by saying, "I hope she gets better, Dad. I want her to be okay, even if we can't see her." It struck me how resilient they had become, how they'd grown despite the challenges they'd faced. They didn't carry anger or resentment, they simply wanted peace, just as much as I did. Hearing about Emily's situation left me feeling strangely at peace. I realized that I no longer felt bitterness or anger toward her. She'd made her choices, and while those choices had left a painful impact, it was now clear that she, too, was facing the consequences in ways none of us could have imagined. I hoped that, someday, she might find a way to heal, even if it was from a distance. And as for us, I knew this was the final chapter in our story with her. Emily's journey was her own, but our life, mine, Jake's, and Emma's, was filled with hope and possibility. We had a new life to live, free from the shadows of the past, and I intended to make it the best life I could give them. The kids and I closed the door on that part of our lives, stepping fully into a future built on trust, love, and resilience. We were ready to move forward, this time with nothing holding us back.